Alright folks, so I want to take a video so you guys could have access to it when you need it, because a lot of times when we get to this part of the writing process, kids start to get confused on how to actually do revising and editing. So remember, today we are just focusing on revising. We'll get to editing later. And today I just want you to focus on these two questions. Number one, does my story make sense? And number two, do I have a beginning, middle, and end? Let's focus on that first part, which was, does my story make sense? Okay, now what I mean by that is when you read your story, can you comprehend what's happening? More often than not, most fifth graders can write a story that does make sense. Every once in a while, I have some kids turn things in and I have no clue what's going on. But typically, for the most part, when you reread your story, and you do actually have to reread the whole thing, because I know you remember writing it, but rereading it makes you make sure what you did and didn't write in that story. What I want you to do is read from start to finish your whole story, and I want you to think, does this make sense? If someone else read this, would they understand what I'm saying? Okay. Number two, do I have a beginning, middle, and end? Also, in my mind, fairly simple, but sometimes this gets a little lost. Okay, so beginning, middle, and end. So in the beginning of your story, that is where we should figure out where your story is taking place and who was there. You're also setting up the basis of the story, so whether that was a trip you took, maybe you went fishing, maybe you visited somewhere from the first time. Most stories have a beginning. Now, the way your story would not have a beginning is if you just randomly started telling me about something you did. So if you started your story by saying, and then my family and I went fishing, I'd be a little lost because you started the story with and then. Okay, so your beginning is telling us where you were, who you were with, maybe how old you were, those details. The middle is where all of those other details are happening. So for example, if you were writing a story about a time you caught the biggest fish of your life this summer, the beginning would be who you were with and maybe what river or lake you were fishing on. And number two would be the details. Maybe you talk about the fishing pole you used, maybe talk about the bait you used, maybe you talk about what it felt like to reel that fish in, all of that stuff, okay? If your story is lacking a middle, it kind of tells us who was there, where you went, and then just says the end. Okay, the middle is where all that extra information is. The end, now that's kind of wrapping everything up into a nice little bow. If you don't have an ending to your story, I'm kind of left wondering what happened next. How did the story end? Okay, think of movies that ended on a cliffhanger and you're like, seriously, that's it? You don't tell us what happened to the characters? They're kind of taking out the ending. So when you're rereading, make sure your story has the beginning, people, places, the middle, all the details, and the end, tying it up into a nice bow. Okay, so here is a sample story that I wrote just for the sake of this. Now, when you actually do the revising, there's a couple things you can do. The easiest thing is just to erase your errors and rewrite over it. When you drafted, if you saved spaces between your lines, you could write your revisions in between the lines. You can also cross out with a pen and rewrite, but that gets a little messy. And then the strategy that takes the longest is just rewriting your whole story, but that works as well. So I'm going to model what it looks like to erase and fix any errors you have in this story. So let's read it. This summer, I went to Montana. My family and I flew from MSP to Kalispell, Montana. When we got there, we rented a car and drove to a park. At the park, we saw a moose and other animals. We also saw the mountains. They were very pretty. In Montana, we went ziplining, swimming, rafting, and saw a rodeo. Now, I purposely wrote some grammar and spelling errors in this. If you caught them, good job. We are not fixing the spelling errors or grammar errors yet. There's a couple words in here spelled incorrectly. I'm missing some punctuation. I know I did that on purpose. We'll get to that later. Today, I want to focus on, first of all, does this story make sense? And second of all, is there a beginning, middle, and end? Okay, so the first thought was, does this story make sense? For the most part, to me, it does make sense. I definitely think it's missing some details. Obviously, this is not a full story, just a sample. And I also feel like it kind of leaves off at the end. But just reading this, to me, it seems like someone could read this and summarize that, okay, Mrs. Wheats and her family went to Montana and they saw some animals and did some things. Overall, you can kind of summarize, yes, it makes sense. We're not left confused. Assess this story for, does it have a beginning, middle, and end? That's where I noticed some errors. So this summer I went to Montana. So right away in that first sentence, I'm going to underline I and Montana. So I am setting who, which is I, and the location, which was Montana, and also when. this summer. So setting, remember, is place, but also time. I also, in the next sentence, say my family and I. So right away in the beginning of my story, I'm telling you the characters of my true story and the setting. So I'm setting that story up. I talked to you a bit about how we got there from flying, and then I start telling you about what happens when we got there. So the beginning of this story really is just those first 2 sentences. This summer I went to Montana, and my family and I flew from MSP to Kalispell, Montana. Now in my real story, I would add in a bit more detail about traveling to get there to set up the beginning a little bit more, but for now it works. When I look at the middle, that's when we get all those extra details. So it says, when we got there, we rented a car and drove to a park. At the park, we saw a moose and other animals. We also saw the mountains. They were very pretty. In Montana, we went ziplining, swimming, rafting, and saw a rodeo. Okay, so I would say up until like this point, that middle is pretty good. Definitely lacking detail. I need to explain more about what the moose looked like, what other animals I saw, maybe describe the mountains a little bit more besides just saying they're very pretty. But there is a middle. The thing this story really lacks is an ending. Okay, I end this story right now by saying in Montana, we went ziplining, swimming, rafting, and saw a rodeo. And then I kind of just stop. Okay, so I'm leaving out other details about what else did we do, or how did we get home, or how long did that story last. So what I need to do is I need to go back in and I need to add in a bit of an ending. So what I'm going to do is pick this sentence. In Montana, we went ziplining, swimming, rafting, and saw a rodeo. And I'm going to pick one of those events to describe a little bit more, and then I'm going to tell you guys how we got home. So I'm going to quickly add that to my story. As you can see, I've added a bit more. So I left the start, but after this last sentence where I kind of left you hanging, I said the rafting was cool but very cold. At the end of the trip, we flew home and made it safely back. Now I would maybe switch up some of the wording of that stuff later in editing, but now we can kind of pick out the start of the story up top, the details in the middle, and at the end, I literally use the word end to let you as the reader know I'm ending my story. Now, not all of you can say end, like the end. We don't really end stories by saying the end in 5th grade, so please don't use that strategy to wrap up your story. But once again, if you were writing a story about going fishing, you could say something along the lines of, and that was the biggest fish I ever caught. Some sort of one sentence. Think about it like telling the person you're talking to that you are done. If you've ever met someone who you're talking to and they stop talking and you're like, what else? And they're like, no, I'm done talking. That's kind of what this story has. I want to know, how are you ending the conversation? How are you ending this story? All right, folks, your turn. And remember, it's going to be tempting to fix some of your spelling and grammar errors. We will get to that, I promise. But today I really want to focus on 1, reread your whole story. Yes, the whole thing, start to finish. Even read it aloud if you can, whisper it, because that's where we catch those errors, okay? Number 2, think to yourself, does this make sense? If someone else read this story, would they understand what I'm saying? And then number 3, do I have a beginning, a middle, and end? And then I want you to add in anything or take anything out to address both of those ideas. Good luck.